by discussing unpivoting data, and then discover pivot charts. And last but not least, we will explore exactly how we can use powerpivot. So the Power Query process has 4 different steps. Firstly, connect. We get the information from other sources and plug it into Excel. This can be done by getting data from the internet, a text file, or a CSV file, and this is just to name a few. We can also transform. When we make any changes or modifications to our dataset, this is part of the transform step. In this lesson, we'll have a look at how we can edit our data, while at the same time, we use different steps, and they're all being recorded on the right-hand side of our window. Thirdly, combine. There are a few functions which we could use in order to combine elements of our data. These may include merge and other functions such as unpivot. Unpivot combines columns and rows, but don't worry, we'll learn a little bit more. And lastly, load. The 4th step is using the information as a report. You can add charts and other elements to improve the visualization of your data. It starts when we close and load our information into Excel. So let's have a look at unpivot. When data is represented in a cross-tab format, it may be impossible for you to start even analyzing data. It means that we may need to spend a little bit more time preparing the data and getting it ready for use. This is exactly what tabular format data would look like. It is relatively easy for us to convert tabular data into a cross-table format. We could do this by using a pivot table. But in this case, we want to do exactly the opposite. So therefore, we'd like to unpivot the information, converting it from cross-tab format into a tabular format. Before we can unpivot a table, it needs to be in a table form. So let's quickly recap how exactly do we go about making a table. First, we can press Ctrl-T, and this converts our data into a table. Then we go over to the Data tab, select the table or range, and the Pivot Power Editor query pops up. Before we can unpivot a table, it needs to be in the right format. So let's quickly recap how do we go about creating that table and the Power Query. So we'll start off by selecting all our data. Once we've selected the data, we can go to our Insert tab and press Unpivot Table. Alternatively, you could always press Ctrl-T too. So we create our pivot table and will ask us exactly what our range should be. Once we're happy with our range or array, you click OK. Now we've created a table, we need to go over to our Power Query. So we go back to our Data tab and we'll head over to Get and Transform Data. In that group, we can see From Table or Range. Once you click on that icon, your Power Query table will pop up. To unpivot, we need to let Excel know exactly which columns we would like to unpivot. So what you can do is right-click with your mouse and in the list, select Unpivot. Here we have 3 options: Unpivot Columns, Unpivot Other Columns, or Unpivot Only Selected Columns. You can also find the Unpivot command in your Transform tab. When we select Unpivot Other Columns, Excel will display our data differently. On the right-hand side of your window, you can see queries and connections. It allows us to create tables with different characteristics. The tables created are created by using the Power Query, and it will update all the original data when it is manipulated. So all you need to do is click on the table and select Refresh. So let's say we've added a new column. We're just going to add some random values here. So the same values as February, but now we have January, February, and March. So it's a whole new column. When we go back to our new table which we created, and we click on Refresh, then our data will automatically refresh and the correct numbers will be applied. Now that we've had a look at unpivoting tables, let's move on to pivot charts. A pivot chart allows us to visually represent all our different data pieces in Excel. Pivot charts and pivot tables work with one another. You need to have a pivot table in order to make a pivot chart. Pivot tables are one of the most powerful tools we could use. It assists us in calculating, summarizing, and analyzing data. It allows us to compare, find patterns, and trends in different data sources. So let's dig deeper. But before we do that, did you know, if you don't already have a pivot table, when you insert a pivot chart, then Excel will automatically create a pivot table for you. If you would only like to have the chart, you can add your data into the powerpivot data model. But we will go into this in more detail regarding the pivot power later on in this session. So let's have a look. How exactly do we create a pivot table? First, we'll start off by selecting our data range. This would be all the data you would like in your pivot table. Then we head over to the Insert tab and select Pivot Table. A table is created with your existing table or range. A pop-up message will appear. You will see the data range and whether the table will be an existing or a new workbook. On the worksheet, drag and drop the headings into the pivot table fields. And when your data is in the correct field, you can also sort your data. Now, sorting your data makes it a lot easier to read and analyze. So now that we have our pivot table ready, we can move over to our pivot chart. When you create a pivot chart, you can click on any cell within your pivot table. Go to the tool groups in the Analyze tab and then select Pivot Chart. The Insert Chart dialog will appear and then you select OK. So we'll start by selecting any cell within our table and then head over to Pivot Table Analyze. In the tool group, we can see Pivot Charts. And once we selected the pivot chart, we could say OK. You have a wide variety of charts to choose from, so select the one which best suits your data. But did you know, when you make any changes to your pivot table, it will also reflect on your pivot chart too, and this other way around. So whichever changes you make to either will reflect on the other. Now there is no need to use a single type of chart when you're creating pivot charts. You can select a variety of different designs. You could choose the ones which you believe would best represent your data. So you'll click on the chart, go to the Design tab, and then click on Change Chart Type in the group. Once you've selected your design, click OK. Now there are 4 components in the pivot chart field. This is exactly the same as when you are creating those pivot tables. Firstly, we get the axis. It is the same as when we have rows in the pivot tables. The legends, which is the same as the columns in our pivot tables. Values, and it is vital to remember that we're using quantities as values here. And last but not least, the report filter. So this could be used to filter different components of your chart. Once again, making the reading of your data a lot easier. Did you know that the shortcut we can use to create a pivot chart is F11? And this brings us to our final topic of today, the Power Pivot. According to Microsoft, Power Pivot enables you to import millions of rows of data from multiple data sources into a single Excel book. It also allows you to create relationships between different data sets. You can also create calculated columns and measures using formulas, build pivot tables and pivot charts, and further analyze the data so that you can make timely business decisions without requiring IT assistance. Originally, the Power Pivot was an add-on, but now it's built into Excel. Power Pivot is expressed by Microsoft by using DAX, Data Analysis Expressions. DAX is a collection of functions, operators, and constants. They're used in a formula or an expression, and it calculates or returns one or more values. But now what's the difference between using Pivot Power and Excel? Pivot Power is a great tool which allows us to import and manipulate hundreds of millions of rows of data. Whereas in Excel, there are hard constraints of just over 1 million rows. Power Pivot allows us to import data from a variety of different sources into a single source. So there's no need to create multiple source sheets, whereas in Excel, we are limited. In Power Pivot, we can manipulate, analyze, and make conclusions without making our computer slower, whereas fortunately, this generally happens when we are using the basic version of Excel. And last but not least, Power Pivot allows us to visualize and manipulate large data sets using Power Charts and the Power BI. Unfortunately, Excel does not yet have these capabilities, but they work hand in hand. So why exactly should we use Power Pivot? When we are using the Power Pivot, we're able to directly load data into a data model. It is also simpler than pulling all the data together from different worksheets, as well as we're able to analyze different tables all at the same time without jumping from one to the other. Before we can start using powerpivot, we need to ensure that it is enabled. In order to do so, we need to follow the next steps. So we'll start by clicking on File and scrolling down to Options. Once we're in Options, we scroll down and select Add-ins. When add-ins are open, you can see right at the bottom we have Manage. Here you need to select COM add-ins and then press Go. Once you press Go, you'll see a new dialog box appears with all your different add-ins. Select powerpivot for Excel and make sure that the box is clicked. Once you're happy, press OK and you'll see powerpivot appear on your ribbon. In the powerpivot ribbon, there are many different options, such as Measure. Here you can create a new measure, or you can manage a measure that has already been created. You also have KPI. This creates a new key performance indicator, or manages those that you've already created. And lastly, you can add to your data model. Remember to start with an empty workbook. Go to your Data tab and select Manage. You will see a window appear. In this window, there is no information just yet, so we need to import the information. Go to the Home group and click on the database and select Access. A pop-up box will appear asking you to import your data. You will need to look for the files unless you already know the exact file location. You can simply look at it by pressing Browse. Click on Next and you'll be asked what you would like to do with your data. In this case, we will select the first option and then click Next again. If there are multiple data tables, select the ones which you would like to work with. You can easily select them by pressing the blocks at the top and then click Finish. You can double check your table selection and then click Close. Excel creates a data model and loads it onto the page. You can make your data easier to work with by creating a pivot table. Click on any cell on the table and click on Pivot Table. A dialog box will appear establishing that the data range and the location of the table is correct. Click on OK and Finish. Once you've clicked on OK, you can organize your data and start analyzing it. So let's see this happening in action. So first and foremost, we're starting with that empty workbook. We head over to Pivot Power and we can see Manage. We click on Manage and a new pop-up box will appear. In the Home tab, we can see the group Get External Data, and there's many different options, from database, from data service, from other sources, or existing connections. In this case, we want to select from database, and we'll choose from access as we're using Pivot Power. A table import wizard appears, and here we can browse our information. So clicking on Browse, we can select the files which we would like to use. Once you're satisfied with your files, click on Next. Here you have two options. You can select from the tables, or you can write a query which is specific to the data imported. In this case, we'd like to select the first option, and then click on Next. Here we can see a list of all our tables. So we can choose the tables which we would like to import. If you'd like to import all of them, tick the box at the top and then click on Finish. You will now see that Excel starts organizing your data and it says Success. Once you've double checked all your tables are there, click on Close. Once our table has been created, we can make sure that we are able to manipulate the data as we'd like it. So in your Home tab, you can see Pivot Table. Once we click on Pivot Table, it will ask us if we'd like to create a new worksheet. If this is the case, click OK. Alternatively, you can keep all your data together on the same worksheet. After we've done this, we're able to drop and drag our information into either the filters, columns, rows, or values, making our data a lot easier to read. This is so simple and easy, as the tables already have existing relationships from the source data. These relationships were automatically created as you imported all the information at the same time. So what do you think would happen if we imported data at a later stage? There's no need to worry. You can still create relationships with the new data based on matching columns. So let's see this in action. You could start by using the fields in your pivot table. At the top of the pivot table field, you select All. Now you can see a complete list of all the tables that are available and the additional one which you just created. Select the table which you created and then select on any column you would like to import into your data set. And of course, Excel's automatically going to prompt you to create connections. Click on Create and we start creating those connections. We'll start by selecting the different tables. And then we need to look at the column 2. Try find a connection which has already been similar to another column. We'll find our related tables, and last but not least, we'll find exactly the same column within that related table, and click OK. But there are certain criteria which column needs in order for us to do this. One of the tables must have a column of a unique and a non-represented value. And it's as easy as that. But not least, we'll see exactly how we can create our very own dashboard. Now, according to Microsoft Excel, the definition of a dashboard is a visual representation of key metrics that allows you to quickly view and analyze data all in one place. Dashboards do not only provide consolidated data views, but a self-service business intelligence opportunity where users can filter and display the data to what's important to them. But let's start off with the benefits and types of dashboards. Dashboards have many benefits, but the top 2. Firstly, you can create a visual report. A visual report is summarized data which easily highlights the strengths and weaknesses of a company, as well as it improves productivity. When we know the aspects which need attention, we can reduce the problems and, of course, increase our productivity too. As the data on your dashboard automatically updates, you do not need to spend unnecessary time updating one worksheet at a time. Now, there are many different types, but the most common 3 are strategic dashboards, analytical dashboards, and operational dashboards. When we are creating these dashboards, there's certain considerations. Firstly, why are you creating this dashboard? Are you creating it to conclude some of your data? Or maybe you would like to display operational status? Or are you measuring business performance? Secondly, we need to select the KPIs or metrics which you would like to fulfill the purpose of your dashboard. Highlight only the necessary data. When we include far too much data or unnecessary data, it may become a distraction. Thirdly, who is this dashboard for? The data needs to be tailored and structured so that the person using it can easily use it and understands every aspect. And lastly, you need to visualize an outline. So create a skeleton map identifying the KPI charts or visuals which you'd like to have on your dashboard. Now, we said it automatically updates. So can you remember? How can we ensure that our raw data is automatically updated? We could simply do this by converting it into a table and ensuring that our data automatically updates or refreshes. So a few dashboards do. We need to number our dashboards. Your dashboard is a story where one thing leads to another. So make sure the people using the dashboard follow the steps in the right order. And the easy way to do this is to number your charts or your sections. Secondly, reduce movement. You can hide all the rows or columns as well as freeze planes to reduce the risk of the user scrolling away and ensuring that all the necessary columns and rows are always visible. Thirdly, provide a user guide. It is always good practice to create a separate worksheet that highlights the different steps. A user guide makes it easier when you are not there and people can easily understand how and what your dashboard is for. And now for a few don'ts. Be mindful of cluttering your dashboard. You don't need to add all the data onto your dashboard. The aim is to identify a problem and make timely decisions. So keep your dashboard relevant and remove unnecessary data. Keep all the must-haves and remove the good-to-haves. Use easy formulas. When you use volatile formulas, it slows down the calculations and makes things very complicated. And lastly, don't keep all of that extra data. If you feel the need to have extra data, you can always copy the dashboard and place a copy somewhere else. And then, if you feel it's needed at a later stage, you could add it when it is necessary. But now, when there are a lot of duplicates, how can we make sure that we are removing those duplicates? If you remember correctly, you may have said you can highlight your entire data set and then click on the Remove Duplicates button. This means that your data is nice and clean and your dashboard will work effectively. But now, before we jump straight into creating that dashboard, there are a few things which we need to do. We need to create a good foundation in order to build an effective dashboard. Firstly, we need to import all our data. So far in this course, we have covered a variety of ways in which we can import our data. Remember, we need to import our data into a specific format, but the format depends on which dashboard you would like to create. We also need to make sure that we clean our data. Each piece of information needs to be in its own cell. Briefly analyze all the data for any typos or errors, and remove all the duplicates, as the data needs to be unique in order to create a dashboard. And then lastly, we need to set up our workbook. You need to have at least 3 tabs in your workbook. You can name the tabs with different headings so you can easily recognize them. So let's have a look at a practical example of how we can create our very own workbook. We need to ensure that there's a data tab, a back-end or processing tab, as well as a dashboard tab. So we'll go down into the bottom where our sheets are. In the sheets, we'll click on it and ensure that we are renaming the sheets. So first we'll start off by renaming our first one data, adding a new sheet, and then we'll rename that sheet back-end or processing, whichever is easiest for you. And then last but not least, we need to create the very own sheet for the dashboard itself. So you can simply rename it dashboard and then we know where to find it. So now that we've completed that step, we need to move on to import our data. So when we are importing our data, we go over to the data tab. We go to get data and then we select our data source. There are a variety of different sources which you can select from, either from the web or any file which you've already created. Then it brings us to our next step of cleaning our data. So let's have a look at our data. The HR department is conducting a study to see if it's worthwhile testing potential candidates before hiring them as sales managers. Now, they tested all their current managers and they would like to create a dashboard. They tested their IQ, their physical quotient, emotional quotient, as well as spiritual quotient. Now, the aim is to see how the sales compare between 2019 and 2020. And they'd also like to see how individuals are performing against their targets. But at the same time, they would like to see if the quotient results available to them have any similarities between the top performing sales managers. So in our data set, we can see all the different results. Firstly, we can see the results of the different quotients. So we have the results of the IQ, the physical quotient, as well as the emotional quotient and spiritual quotient. Then we have the results of the number of products sold in 2020, as well as the target number sold in 2020. Now, HR has already identified a few things which they would like to see based on their test results. They would like to see how the individuals tracked against their targets. So we can keep the number of products sold in 2020, but they would also like to see a comparison between the sales managers in 2019 and 2020. But we do not need the sales margins in 2022. So we can go ahead and delete all of that information. And that brings us to visualization. So now we already know what we want on our dashboard. But let's start visualizing it. So let's imagine what it's going to look like. So we already know we have the test results. And we would like these results to be displayed in a bar graph. Then we have the sales comparison between 2019 and 2020. And we would like the comparison to be created in a line chart. And then last but not least, we would like to see the sales manager's performance versus their targets. And this can be displayed in a pie chart. But now before we move on to create our dashboard, can you remember the index function? We will be using the index function quite a lot throughout the remainder of the lesson. So if you're not yet comfortable with this function, I would highly recommend you go back and revise your lessons before going ahead and building a dashboard. But for those of you who can remember, the index function shows a value at a given location or an array. So now that we've imported and cleaned our data, it is time for us to start building the back end of our dashboard. So we'll start by inserting the manager's name. We could easily do this by allocating a number to each manager's name. Here we can see we have 10 managers. So we'll name them from 1 to 10. This is just to help us to ensure that our worksheet stays nice and neat, but at the same time we're providing all the information. So we'll start by manager's number, and let's select 1. Then we'll move on by finding the corresponding name. So here we use our index function. So we'll say equals to @index, and then we need to select our array. So in this case, it will be all the managers' names, all the way from Ava to William. Then we need to go back to the back end and make sure it's corresponding to that number. So here we'll select the cell B1. Then we'll close our brackets. So let's see if it's working. What happens when we use the number 3? Here we can see Charlotte's name appears, and then 10 and it's William. So it means that the information is corresponding. Let's keep it to 1 to keep it simple. Secondly, we want the test results. And these are the test results of the different quotients. So we'll start by creating that first heading, Q, for the different quotients. Remember, here we want the IQ, the physical quotient, the emotional quotient, as well as the spiritual quotient. And we want to see what these test results were. So that will be our next heading. Here's where we use our index function once again. So we'll say equals to @index, and then we'll select our array. And our array will be all the different test results. So once we selected that array, then we need to select the row number. So going all the way back, we'll say row, and in this case, it will be -4. And then we'll say we need to ensure that it corresponds to the number once again and close our brackets. Now remember, if we drag and drop this all the way down, then our information may change. So we need to use that F4 function. So ensuring that all our cells are locked in with F4 and then clicking enter, now we can drag and drop our results all the way down. Although, you may have noticed our IQ and our other quotients were in percentages. So remember, you can always format the cells, go to percentages, and reduce the decimal places to whichever number you like, and click OK. Now that we have all our data, we press Ctrl-T and ensure that we're changing it into a table. We know we have headers, so we select OK. Next, we want to find out exactly what our results were for the sales in 2019 and 2020. So we'll select our sales numbers over here. So we'll start off by selecting the different months, because remember, each month of the year it was different. And this is where Excel makes our life nice and easy too. So if we insert the first 2 months, once again, we can simply drag and drop all the way down and it will go up to December. Then we want 2019 results as well as 2020 results. Once we have all that information, we can go ahead, can say equals to @index and selecting our array, which once again is on our data sheet, and we want the results for 2020 sales, so we'll select all our data and click OK. Moving back to the dashboard, we need to select the correct row. In this case, we -19, and we want to start as it's corresponding to B1 and adding that F4 function once again, just ensuring we can drag and drop our formula all the way down without any errors. And now that we've done that, we can drag and drop it all the way down. And we can see all our results. Now remember, you can do exactly the same for 2019. So selecting our array. Once you've selected the array, we already know that the row will be -11, and we want it to correspond to the back end B1 to make sure it's the correct manager, and using our F4 function. Once we've locked in our formula, we can once again drag and drop all the way down to ensure that we're getting the correct results. Selecting all the data, we press Ctrl-T, and remember, we do have headings for this table, and click OK. So let's just make sure that all our information is corresponding. Ava, we'll go to her sales in 2020 and we'll see that it was $40. So in this case, we know that our formulas are correct. So our last and final table we want to create is our targets versus our performance. So here we'll select different products. And let's select the products, calling them A, B, C, and D. And in the second column, we're going to say the sales targets. And last but not least, we'll select the sales that the managers had actually achieved. So this will be the last time we use our index function. So we'll say equals to @index and selecting our array. So this will be the sales target table. Here's all our information, and we know that the row is corresponding to -11, and we need to ensure that it matches with our manager number in cell B1 in the back end of our dashboard. So scrolling all the way back up, B1, using our F4 function, locking in our formula, and clicking OK. Now that we have the targets, we also need to make sure we drag and dropping that formula all the way down. Last but not least, we need the sales made for each product. So say @index, open our array, and we'll see how many sales were made. So selecting all of our data within our array, we'll say row -11 and corresponding to that manager's number in the back end B1, locking in our formula with the F4 function for the last time. And once it's locked in, we can drag and drop the formula all the way down. Lastly, selecting all of our information and creating that table. So Ctrl-T, creating our table with our headings and selecting OK. Now that we have all our tables ready, it's time for us to create our final masterpiece. So firstly, we'll start off by creating a heading within that dashboard. So our dashboard will be Manager Sales Results. Because remember, the aim of this dashboard is to see how the quotients are affecting the results and the performance of different managers. Then we need to insert our first chart. So we said that the different quotients are going to be represented by a bar chart. So we go into recommended charts and select the chart which we best like. In this case, I quite like the 3D one. Now that we have our chart, we need to make sure that it is on our dashboard. So right-clicking, we can move our chart all the way to dashboard and click OK. And we'll do the same thing for the other two charts. So we said the second chart we would like to be a bar graph. So going over to our Insert tab, Recommended Charts, and here we have our line chart. Selecting our line chart, which we like the best, with different points, once again we need to move it back over to that dashboard tab and clicking OK. Now last but not least, we have our performance versus our targets. Here we said we want to create a pie chart, just to create a little bit of variety and making our dashboard nice and interesting. Remember, an interactive and presentation is always very good to have. Here we can select the one which looks the best and then click OK. Once we're satisfied, we move it back over to our dashboard. And then once we have all our charts on our dashboard, we can always move them around in order for it to look a lot better and to display the information so that we can understand it, or the other people using the dashboard also can understand it very clearly. Now that we have a fairly good idea about what exactly we would like our dashboard to look like, let's move on to refining our dashboard. So remember, a dashboard can always look nice and simple, but we need to make sure that it's effective and interactive too. So we need to ensure that we have easy access to the manager's names. So in this case, we always want to make sure the manager's name is in uppercase, just because it's easier to read. So we'll use the corresponding name, but remember, it will be corresponding to that number 2. Now that we've added the manager's names, we need to make sure that we don't need to go back into the back end of the dashboard, so we can add ActiveX controls. In this case, we're simply going to use the arrow buttons. So here we need to make sure that we are assigning a macro. So our current value will be 1. This means that our minimum value will be 1 too. And we have 10 managers, so the maximum value will be 10. And this will be linked to our cell in our back end. And if you guessed it, B1, you were correct. And we click OK. So now you'll see every time that we click on the different arrows, whether it be up or down, then it's going to change between 1 and 10. And the information on our dashboard changes too. Now that all of our information is on our dashboard, we need to make sure that our presentation is refined so we can clean our data. Remember, when you're creating that final dashboard, get creative. You could use any different types and colors which you like. You can also use different ActiveX controls. Try different charts. They don't all need to be bar graphs or line charts, whichever charts display your information the best. And last but not least, use different commands. Get nice and creative and see if you can get the points to highlight between the sales of 2019 and 2020. Or can that pie chart move into different directions according to different managers? There are so many different ways in which you can create an interactive dashboard, making sure that it displays your data to the best of your ability. And this is only the start. Dashboards are a lot of fun, so I'd always encourage you to go ahead and create your very own dashboard and see how you can change up your data in order to make it interactive